Pretty much everybody's getting their clay to this point. I don't think I've seen anybody not getting their clay to this point. The difference is this is nice and slick, and I keep going around saying more water, more water, more water, and I also am having people bleeding because they're not using enough water and the grit, it gets too bad underneath their hand and dries out and all that. What I'm seeing is this elbow is often not touching your body or it's sitting on top of your thigh. This is all nice and feels sturdy, and it's sturdy in a lot of ways, but the forward and backward motion, regardless of how hard I'm pressing down, because of the flexibility of my skin and the clothing, my hand is going to move. This isn't going to brace my hand from going back and forth. So you either need to go up on here in the inside of your thigh, which is the second option if you're going to go out to your leg. First option is try and get it into either your torso, the core of your body, or over here right into the hip joint, so you're pressing against your pelvis. Then to push forward on the clay, I am also seeing a few people get all nicely braced and then push forward, which means you started out braced but then eliminated it as soon as you started doing anything with your clay. And now you're not pushing forward enough that it's really noticeable, but just a little bit, you're not moving your body. So don't push forward with your arm, push forward with your body. Lean your body forward. If you're sitting back here and leaning your body forward just barely gets to touching the clay, then scoot up. If you have to be totally on the wheel where you're completely straddling it, that's fine. But you need to be bracing well enough that you can hold it steady, and that's much easier to do with body weight rather than with arm strength. Okay, so I'm pushing with this part of my hand. If you're pushing over here, even if your hand's in the right position, but I'm pushing sideways, I'm not braced in this direction, I'm braced in this direction. So this is where I want to be pushing it. This hand goes down. If I say lean into it a little bit more, I mean lean into it this way. That doesn't mean you have to push in both places, because if you want your clay to go up or down, you have to put more pressure in one place, less in the other. So a little more pressure, and when you get it wet, sometimes I'm seeing slip pile up here. When I add water, I usually do that, and that makes sure the water and or slip gets underneath my hand, instead of just pouring it on until it overflows everywhere. Just a little bit here, and if I'm feeling it stay dry underneath my hand, but I can see there's water there, I just go and grab that. Sometimes I'll also go and grab that slip and pull it up into the side. No reason to have it in your splash pan if it's going to be useful here. B-Mix is much smoother than your clay, and so your slip is a lot gooier, and there's no real grit in it. If any of you are seriously having issues where your hand's bleeding because you've been grinding it against the wheel so hard, you were doing something wrong in order to get it to bleed. But instead of just trying to make you grind your bleeding hand against the wheel until you get it right, get some B-Mix. You can either get your bag if you've paid your fee, or split a bag with somebody so that you can still take a little more clay. You will have to find somebody to split it with. All right, so finish century. Lean forward in, make it taller. I added water because it got dry. B-Mix also goes from being really slick to really sticky dry really quickly. So pushing in to make it taller. Here's some of that little popping. Some of that could be, that's some of the irregularities that are left in the clay after wedging, and occasionally that's air bubbles. If you hear that popping, you want to get rid of any air bubbles that are reappearing. So you cone it up for that reason. This is a little more than you guys are working with, so I am going to put my hands on both sides. With the small amount, I don't ever do that. I just push it up with this hand. You can also, use your thumb so that your hand gets taller, like that, but using it on both hands to cone up. Now, this part's the hardest part to center, right here. So while your clay is all skinny, make sure you push that up. If you do it with your hand, great. If it's not working with your hand, grab it and push it up a little bit so that your clay is not getting underneath your hand, because you don't want to try and center by grinding your hand, slamming it, but it's not slamming, pushing really hard down into the wheel head. Okay, now I brace really firmly but against my leg, but not entirely firmly against the clay, loosely against the clay. And then I'm going to push the clay back down. Now, it's going to start out mushrooming, and if I don't put enough pressure and it stays and that mushroom gets worse, that means I'm doing something wrong. But if it mushrooms to a certain point and then stops where it gets to my hand, and then I push the clay all the way down so that it fills all available space, you can center it much quicker. This is a lot more centered. Still has that wobble right down there. Because when the friction caught my hand, I wiggled just for a second, and so when it got down there uneven before I went up. So I'm going to again push this clay up into the rest of the clay, or cut it away, or whatever you want to do. Sometimes I'll even use the side of my pinky here, not the tip, because if you use the tip, you do that and make the wobble a lot worse. It catches. But I sometimes will push with the side of my pinky just so that I can get that clay up into where my hand is braced, because that fleshy part of your hand that's below the wrist right here is going to wobble a little bit just because it's fleshy, and so that's where some of you have that little stubborn wobble at the bottom that doesn't want to go away. So push forward. Now when you're pushing forward, if you've got it low down, oh, and this is what an air bubble looks like, by the way. Apparently I didn't wedge this nearly enough. One of them I thought I wedged enough, the other one I knew I didn't. Stab your air bubbles. They feel like bumps. They feel like hard patches in your clay. Get rid of your excuse me. Get rid of your air bubbles. All right, so push down, and then I go to push back up, and I'm not putting enough pressure on the top, and so I get this concave thing. That also is failing to center there, and sometimes I get slip in there, and I think I'm leveled off, right? But some of that slip, then I go to make my entry, and that soft spot is going to pull me off center. So, in order to prevent that, when you're pushing it back up, push down on the outside while you push in on the inside, and it'll make it go up in the center. Now, if you pull your hand back far enough, you'll be able to see that little cone forming, and then when that cone turns to hard clay and stops being slip, you can just push it off. Then now that's not got that divot anymore. And if your slip is all over there and splashing, you can just clean your wheel and then pull that slip back up into your clay. It's great. Okay, I'm pushing with my pinky here to get that clay up. All right. Another air bubble, so I'm going to grind this down a bit. Push it up. I think I got my air bubble gone now. I'm feeling that little bit of tugging because I had the slip wasn't underneath my hand. That part dried out. Now it's centered. Hooray. I gently release. Oh yeah, on the release, again, you're gently leaning back and lifting up your hand at the same time. It's not a slide off the top, because then what you do is you are pressing in both directions and then you go to slide off the top and you add a wobble because you suddenly release with one hand while you slowly release with the other one, and that's going to make it continue to wobble. I still have an air bubble in here, but it's a little deeper down, and I'll show you where that will cause a problem and how to fix it. Okay, so pressing the clay, you can see that little bit of a wobble that's happening, but I'm going to pretend I don't notice that now so that you can see what to do with your entry. You can do an entry like this, you can do an entry like this, you can do an entry like this. There's lots of different ways to do an entry. I have a new favorite. Brace your hand in centering position on the outside, making sure, again, it's still nice and slick. If you pull up some slip, make sure you've got plenty of that. If you've got too much, scrape it to the outside, put it in your bucket, whatever. Then put your finger against your thumb that way and start pressing down here. Again, every time you feel it start to get dry, stop what you're doing and make it. Now that air bubble just made that start wobbling. And I found my air bubble at this point, and it pulled it slightly off center, so now I go in and I don't know right now exactly where it is, so just stab a bunch to be pretty sure I get it. Alright, so I've got a slight wobble in there now. You can either close it back up and start over, or you're still in centering position with this hand. Instead of pushing like this, you can go ahead and curl that clay into your hand. And there, now I found some more of that air bubble that I didn't get rid of last time. So I'm going to kind of scrape through it, work it back and forth. Hear that little pop? I got most of the air bubble there. Okay, I got the air bubble, it's gone. So, push back into centering position. You have to push down if you want to recenter your clay after you've started making your entry. Ideally, you do the little cone and then you're going to push down here. Now, stop when you're about a ½ inch from the bottom. If you can tell where that is, great. If you can't, grab your needle tool, stab it until it hits metal, then touch your finger to the clay and you'll see how much you have left. That difference, right, from there to the tip of my finger, that's the thickness of the clay. It's a hair on the thick side as far as it can be a little bit thinner than this and still be appropriate, but I like it to leave that much on the bottom because I like to trim a well inset foot. So that's about exactly what I like to have. You can have a little bit less or a little bit more, not too much either way. Then I'm going to pull it open. Now this you can still, in order to steady that clay out, sometimes it'll start a wobble when you pull it open because of friction or slight irregularities in your centering or your clay. And, oh, by the way, what I'm doing now with my thumb, I'm pushing down with the side of my thumb to compress the bottom so it's all flat and smooth. Now it's not just smoothing, it's also compressing. The pressure is important as well as the smoothing. I mean, one, you don't want those funky rings and domes and divots that happen when you pull your finger out. But two, you also want it compressed. The reason your wooden rib has a square corner, if you have the right one, this one isn't the right one, but the reason it has a 90-degree angle here is so that you can go and be compressing the bottom and sharpening up that edge. You can compress and sharpen that edge at the same time with your rib. This one's better for bowls because it's got a adjustable curve, so to speak. We can pretend this is your wooden rib because that's got the right shape. So you press down, compress the bottom, and I've got the bottom as wide as I want it to be when I make my cylinder. Now, the next, so entry, opening, compress, all before I've tried to make it any taller.